What up, Cavs Nation? I'm your host, Ethan Sands, and I'm back with another episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. I'm joined by your favorite beat reporter, Chris Fedor. Chris, it feels like I haven't talked to you in a while. How have you been? How was your weekend?
Weekend was good, man. Just a lot of time with the family. We did this thing that we do every single year. It's called Fairview Summerfest. Holly grew up in Fairview Park, obviously, and she grew up going to this thing, and they've got a parade on Friday night, and then they've got a whole fair that they do at one of the schools nearby. So they've got rides, they've got games, they've got a dunk tank, they've got basketball, they've got fireworks at night, they've got a bunch of food there as well. So we're just kind of continuing the tradition that Holly started when she was a youngster, and we're doing it with Elliot. So he loves it. He went on old jalopy cars, and then he went on the fun slide multiple times with Mama and Dada. So it was a really good weekend. And then Sunday we spent some time at Grandma and Grandpa's pool. Elliot was jumping from the side into the pool. It was really, really good. And then this weekend coming up, we'll see what the weather holds, and we'll see what we have scheduled there. But it's been a while. How have things been for you?
Things have been fine. I have been just gearing up for another NABJ convention. I'm very excited to go. I've got my clothes all ironed out and picked out and got them done at the cleaners because if it's not a family reunion, it's definitely a fashion show. It's one or the other, if not both. But Chris, did you guys win any stuffed animals or anything at the fair games around the? You talked about having there be basketball there. Anything you might have won?
So he came back with like a stuffed bear, like a small stuffed bear, which was fine. He's more into the rides at this point in time than the games. Some of the games are a little bit difficult for him. So if he's going to get his games fixed, he usually goes to Dave and Buster's. There's more like kiddie type games there for him. At some of these fairs, it's throwing beanbags at bottles. It's like shooting the water gun into the what is it, like a clown's mouth or something like that, and it goes all the way to the top. And then there's like a thing that he can do with a fishing rod, but the prize is a goldfish, and I'm not bringing a goldfish home. That's not happening. So I don't want that prize, and I'm not going to allow him to throw a tantrum because we're not taking a goldfish home. We're not at that stage yet. So no, we just focused more on the rides. And of course there's a playground there as well. So he made sure that he got his slide working.
Sounds great. Sounds like a lot of fun. And I know I was asking you a couple of questions, but this is going to be another rendition of Hey Chris, where our subtexters from our subtext channel that you can subscribe to for $3.99 a month, or just try it out with a 14-day free trial. Obviously, in the summertime, it's a little bit weird, right? Because we give a lot of different information based on what we hear throughout the season, what we hear throughout our lives and our connections, especially with Chris being one of, if not the best tapped in Cavs beat reporter when it comes to the entire league. I feel like this is where you can get that information. But we also allow it to become a community with our subtexters where they can ask us questions throughout the week, and we have them on the podcast. And if they want to, their name and their state or city can be shouted out on the podcast as well. So it's another day of that. And Chris, I know we have some different things that we're going to get into later, but right now, it's another rendition of Hey Chris. So let's jump right on in, okay?
All right. Yep, let's do it.
So, first one from our subtext group says, great article by Chris on Isaac Okoro situation. I agree, even if he resigns, he should be 8 to 9 off the bench. The fact he has started says a lot about the wing situation. What do you guys think are the chances that Jaylen Tyson is on the roster and gets Okoro's minutes? Well, I think we had an entire podcast about this topic, but no shade at all. We're going to get into it again for you guys. Obviously, we have seen a lot from Jaylen Tyson already, just what he can bring from a shooting perspective, his size, and his willingness and desire to grow as a defender, right, Chris? When we were talking about the draft beforehand, when we were given our top 5, top 4, whatever it was, of the candidates that we thought that the Cavs could take with the number 20 overall pick, Jaylen Tyson came up multiple times. And it was because of his ability to score, his ability to create his own shot, but also his willingness to play multiple positions and learn in different aspects of the game. And because the opportunity arose in Summer League for Jaylen Tyson to not only be a kind of de facto point guard when Craig Porter Jr. was on the floor, but also fit into the roles as a kind of maestro with Craig Porter Jr. and be a shooting guard and even a small forward. So you got to see him in different roles. And I think that showed a lot to his perspective and what he can bring if Isaac Okoro isn't on this team anymore after this offseason. And I feel like that decision, and we've talked about this off the pod, Chris, could happen rather soon when it comes to the decision for what the Cavs do.
Yeah, I think the main thing when it comes to Jaylen is that long term, he's the eventual logical replacement for Karis LeVert. I think that's how the Cavs are looking at him. I don't think they went into this draft, Ethan, with the 20th overall pick in a weak draft, saying to themselves, okay, we need to find an immediate rotation player. If we find somebody that we like that can do that, that also fits the skill set that we're looking for from the 20th pick, then okay, fine. That works out for us. But we feel pretty good about the top 8, 9, 10 in this rotation, depending on how deep new head coach Kenny Atkinson wants to go. So there isn't going to be pressure. There isn't going to be a level of urgency to get this guy on the floor. But the truth is, they did draft somebody with 3 years of college experience. They did draft somebody who's 21 years old. He's more mature than some of the guys that they've drafted in the past, some of the other guys in this class. He has more college experience than some of these guys in the class, and he's got a more NBA-ready game and a more NBA-ready body than some of these guys in this class. Like, he's not 19, sort of like Johnny Furphy, somebody else that the Cavs were looking at with the 20th pick. He's not 19 years old like Alex Sarr, who was a top 2 pick in this year's draft. This is somebody who's got some seasoning. He's got some polish. He's got some readiness to his game. So I've been talking for a while on various podcasts and interviews that I've done around the country and locally. It would not surprise me at all, Ethan, if it doesn't happen coming straight out of training camp and going into opening night, then by the middle of the season, by the end of the season, it would not surprise me at all if Jaylen Tyson was getting consistent, regular rotation minutes for this team, because I think he fills in some gaps and he provides some things that the Cavs could certainly benefit from in terms of his 3-level scoring, in terms of his playmaking, in terms of his versatility positionally, in terms of his ability to defend and disrupt passing lanes and things along those lines, if he buys into that end of the floor and if he's willing to accept a different kind of role than the one that he had at Cal when he was Mr. Do Everything, and the one that he had in the final couple of games of Summer League when he was Mr. Do Everything for the Cavs. Like, that role is not going to be waiting for him here unless something significant changes with the roster or unless there's significant injuries across the roster, which is always a possibility in an 82-game season. But I don't think the Cavs are looking at this as we've got to get him into the rotation immediately. We're going to find a way to do that coming out of training camp. It's not like that at all. But like I said, because of his skill set, because of his versatility, it would not surprise me if he finds a way into consistent minutes by the midway point of the season and certainly by the end of the season. I think he's the kind of guy, Ethan, that he's going to make it hard on this coaching staff to keep him off the floor. And that's something that you like, and that's something that you should feel good about if you're this organization. He was one of the best rookies at Summer League.
Yeah, Chris, and I mean, you mentioned the adjustment to wanting to play a role and wanting not to have to be the it guy. And, like, I think that's also partially what Jaylen Tyson was talking about at his introductory press conference, right? Like, he understands he's coming to a win now team. He's coming
Mm-hmm.
to a team that has an identity, that has a all-star, all-NBA, MVP caliber player in Donovan Mitchell, but you also understand that what his weakness was defense. And he came in saying, I want to make an all defensive team my rookie year. That's an understanding, even if it is just a mentality or
Yep.
whatever he's saying, words at this point, like that is more than a lot of rookies would have coming in. They're like, well, I was the best in college. I'm going to come and be the best player on this team.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the reality of the situation. And I
Right.
think the maturity and the things that Jaylen Tyson had to go through throughout his college career do help him in this sense. So if you want more insight on that, go and listen to our podcast that is exclusively talking about Jaylen Tyson. But
I think
we're
there's
going to
one
move
more
on.
thing to add though on this because if you think about it, this offseason, the Cavs have fielded offers. They have gotten inquiries on Karis LeVert and his availability. We've talked about the various different trade packages that the Cavs internally have discussed and the various offers that they've received from a lot of teams across the NBA. Those trade conversations aren't centered necessarily on the core four. They want to keep the core four together as best they possibly can, unless they're blown away by an offer. Those trade conversations are centered on the other guys, right? Isaac Okoro, who is a restricted free agent, who could get a sign and trade type package that intrigues the Cavs enough that they would say yes to it. George Niang, Dean Wade, Karis LeVert. Those are the guys that the Cavs are having conversations with, that they would actually be willing to move in the right package. And it doesn't mean that the Cavs are going to trade Karis this offseason, but if you start to have those kinds of conversations now, it could carry over into the season. It could take you up into the trade deadline. And if Jaylen Tyson is ready for a bigger role, if Sam Merrill emerges and he's ready for a bigger role, whatever case you want to make, like that could make Karis LeVert more expendable. I'm not saying, again, that the Cavs are definitely going to do that, but he's got value across the NBA, Ethan, and he's relatively pricey. And this is his walk year. This is the final year of his contract, an expiring contract in today's NBA with all of the restrictions, with all of the new rules in place. That could be valuable. That could bring something back to the Cavs. And if they're looking at Jaylen Tyson as an eventual Karis LeVert replacement, and I believe that's how they are looking at him, Karis LeVert is probably not going to be back beyond this year. If the Cavs know that as well, do they feel like it would be worth it to try and cash in and get something of value in return for Karis before he just walks in free agency for nothing? And I know that's down the road, but that's how this team has to think. This team's going to get extremely expensive moving into the future. And having somebody like Jaylen Tyson, a first-round rookie this year, the 20th overall pick, on a team-friendly, controllable rookie deal, if he can get significant rotational minutes into the future, especially next year, that is a big, big deal for this team to balance out their salary cap situation.
And Chris, I mean, I think I've been meaning to say this on this podcast. I think when the conversation circles around like players that the Cavs are willing to trade, I
Mm-hmm.
think it would be really drastic for this team as it's built right now if there were to somehow be a trade made and it would include Isaac Okoro and Dean Wade, potentially like
Mm-hmm.
in a 3-team deal or potentially in a sign-in trade with potentially getting Dorian Finney-Smith and Cam Johnson or whatever it might have been, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think because of what the Cavs would be lacking already in the defensive aspect at the point of attack defense with Isaac Okoro, if he were to walk this year, this off season, I think they need somebody like Dean Wade to stick around
Yeah.
because of what he can bring on the defensive end, what he can do in switching situations and things like that. Because obviously you have Jared Allen, you have Evan Mobley who can handle a lot of things when it comes to the interior, but you don't have someone as much who can range that much on the exterior, on the perimeter.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, you can give some of that load to Karis LeVert, but when you're talking about guys like Cade Cunningham, you're talking about bigger guys. Paolo Banchero comes to mind, right? You need somebody who's going to be able to get into the nitty gritty, get into their bodies, and be able to be physical as well as be able to make sure that when they put the ball on the ground, it's going to be contested. So I think a trade or a situation where the Cavs end up losing Dean Wade and Isaac Okoro could be detrimental for this team.
Completely agree with you. And that's first and foremost when it comes to this team. They're coming off a 48-win season. They're coming off back-to-back playoff appearances. They're coming off an Eastern Conference semifinals appearance. It's time to take the next step. And this isn't a situation where they have to start making these cost-cutting maneuvers right now when those are still the goal. So I think for them, everything is predicated on, okay, what's the package that would come back to us in a potential trade? How does that make us better? How does that make us work? How can we work with that in new Coach Kenny Atkinson's system? What kinds of things does he want from his bench? What kinds of things does he want from his starting lineup? What kinds of skill sets match with the way that he wants to play? All those different things come into play. But I'm right there with you. For this team to potentially lose both of those guys this offseason in one offseason, that would be tough. And I just don't see a scenario where that plays itself out. And I'm not saying it's a guarantee either, Ethan, that they do sign and trade Isaac Okoro. I think that's a possibility. But I also think there's a strong possibility, given how much the Cavs have already invested in him, given how much they like him, given how much they value him, that they bring him back and that he's here and he's playing for the Cavs in maybe a smaller role than what he has had in the past, because JB Bickerstaff was a defense-first coach and he leaned on those kinds of lineups and he leaned on those kinds of players. And obviously Isaac was a big deal to that, and Kenny wants to play a different kind of style. Up-tempo, space the floor, three-point shooting. So might be a lesser role waiting for Isaac if he does come back, but certainly still a valuable piece because there isn't anybody on this team that defends at the point of attack like he does.
And also kind of how long it's taken for other teams to dish out offers and it not come back as how they might have liked it. And last thing on this topic, I do my research when it comes to look at all the players' social medias and stuff on a daily basis to try and keep up with whatever they may have going on in their daily lives. Isaac Okoro did have his second training camp with some kids. He also did just work out, I believe it was today, with Donovan Mitchell. It looked like they were at the same gym. And if you know, obviously you know Chris, but the relationship between Isaac and Donovan, two guys that have their lockers right next to each other, two guys that joke around consistently in the locker room, probably to an extent that you think they're bullying each other. But like they have a really good bond. It felt like there was high energy, and it seemed like those two guys are still getting along like nothing else is going to happen, right? So that's a potential. We'll see. Like Chris said, it's not 100% certain that the sign and trade or any trade kind of happens, but we'll have to just continue to wait and see on that one. But next question from our subtexters comes from United States Air Force Sarge. He says, hanging out here near the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colorado, Scottie Barnes was Rookie of the Year, has made an all-star team, and approached averaging a triple-double. And he has that vital trait of wanting to be the alpha. Because of his three-point shooting, Barnes alleviates the necessity to trade Allen. With the help of hindsight, would have drafting Barnes instead of Evan Mobley been so much better going forward? I don't think the Cavs would have gone away from, based on the roster that they have right now, I don't think the Cavs would have chosen Scottie Barnes over Evan Mobley or gone back and been like, we made a wrong decision. At least that's what I would have thought.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they're sitting there saying that we made the wrong decision. They like Scottie Barnes. They worked him out prior to the draft. He was in consideration for the third overall pick. I think they're very happy with Evan Mobley. I think they believe highly in Evan and the growth that he can have over the next couple of years. They see him as a franchise pillar. They locked him into a big contract for that reason. Kenny Atkinson has big ideas for how to use Evan offensively, how to deploy him defensively, things along those lines. I totally get that the idea of Scottie Barnes would be fascinating on this team. The length, the athleticism, the perimeter defense, the ability to play the 3 and the 4. But I just don't think the Cavs are losing sleep over that particular decision. I think the Cavs believe that Evan should have been Rookie of the Year over Scottie Barnes. I think the Cavs believe that Evan is going to be a better player down the road than Scottie Barnes. And I think the Cavs believe that Evan impacts winning at a higher level than Scottie Barnes has throughout the course of his career. And I also think you have to take into account a few different things, Ethan. When it comes to evaluating Evan Mobley, it can be so difficult for people because the default is to just look at the production, right? How many points per game, how many rebounds per game, how many assists per game, blocks, steals, all that kind of stuff. I just don't think Evan is the kind of player that is ever going to be solely defined by that. Because in large part, production is tied to opportunity. And if you think about this situation that Evan is in, he's always going to be no higher than third on the team in touches. He's always going to be no higher than third on the team in shot attempts. He's always going to be no higher than third on the team in usage rating. As long as this roster construction is still in place, with Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell as the drivers of this offense, as the ball dominant guards that initiate, create so much for this team. And that's going to be the case with Kenny Atkinson too. As long as that's going to be the case, it's going to be hard for Evan to go out there and average 20 to 24 points per game. It's going to be hard for him to put up the kinds of numbers that Scottie Barnes may be able to put up because he has more opportunity, because he has more freedom, because he has less mouths to feed. In Toronto, if you think about it, moving forward, it's probably going to be the Scottie Barnes show. They don't have Pascal Siakam anymore, right? They don't have Gary Trent Jr., who's going to chuck up a bunch of shots. They do have RJ Barrett, but it's basically Scottie Barnes, RJ Barrett, Emmanuel Quickley. They're building it around Scottie Barnes. So the opportunities that he's going to get in Toronto, I think they're going to be vastly different than they are going to be for Evan. So I think if you're going to evaluate Evan properly, I think if you're going to judge it correctly, I think you have to look at his impact and the nightly impact that Evan brings offensively and defensively. He's already a top 5 player in the game on the defensive end of the floor. That's nothing that you just overlook. That's nothing that you take for granted at this age, at this stage of his career and his development, to be that good, that impactful defensively. Scottie Barnes may never get to that point as a defensive player.
Or as an offensive player, if that's what people want to compare it to.
For sure.
Right? Because, I mean, that's really what it comes down to, right? I know there's not the glitz and glamour that comes with defense, but Lord have mercy, it's half of basketball, ain't it? It's offense and defense, right? Since I started covering the NBA in October 30th, whatever the date was, we have talked about how much people have negated the defensive aspect of the ball when it comes to how good a player is. Evan Mobley, as you mentioned, is top 5, top 10, you want to debate it, whatever. But, like, there is no discrepancy that he is one of the best defenders in the game. Scottie Barnes is one of the best of anything right now, right? He's one of the best young guys. He's one of the best up-and-comers, but he's not top 5, top 10, top 15 in anything. And so if you want to say that, like, he had more offensive production this far, sure, you can say that. But there's also been statements made by the Cavs organization that they haven't prioritized Evan Mobley's development, especially offensively, because they knew how good he was on defense. They said, all right, we don't have to because you're going to do this on defense, and we have guys around you that are going to score.
Yep. Look, the Cavs have made back-to-back playoff appearances. They advanced to the Eastern Conference semifinals. Winning has been synonymous with this organization since Evan Mobley was drafted third overall in 2021, Ethan. That is not a coincidence. That is not something that you can just assume that somebody else would have that level of impact on winning basketball, or that the Cavs would be as successful as an organization if it was somebody other than Evan Mobley that they took with the third overall pick in 2021. So I think people at this point are taking Evan Mobley for granted. And I totally get it. A lot of people just want the eureka moment where he comes back from an offseason of hard work and all of a sudden he's this great perimeter player and all of a sudden he's this reliable jump shooter, both from the mid-range, elbow extended, and out to the three-point line. I just don't think that that's going to be the natural organic progression of Evan. I think it's going to be little improvements along the way. Just like if you think about this past year, like, did he make drastic improvements? No, but he was clearly more comfortable as a passer, right? He was clearly more comfortable getting rebounds, pushing the ball in transition, initiating offense that kind of way. He was clearly more comfortable with that baby turnaround fadeaway. He was clearly more comfortable playing out of the pocket. He was clearly more comfortable in terms of creating his own offense rather than having everything created for him. Those are small improvements, right? Those aren't the jump from 16 points per game to 22 points per game or 16 points per game to 25 points per game. But I just think that's the kind of progression that Evan Mobley is going to continue to make throughout his career. And you just have to be a little bit patient.
All right, Chris, I just realized one of our subtext questions goes back to the Okoro conversation, and I wanted to
Yeah.
knock that out before we got too far off of that. But here it is. Would the Cavs really trade Isaac Okoro for DFS, Dorian Finney-Smith, straight up, or would there be more to it? DFS has been a below-average three-point shooter for the last 2 seasons and doesn't have the complementary skills to play the three. Feels like an expensive version of Dean Wade without the rebounding.
Right. So these conversations get really, really complicated, I think, because it's just not player for player. And there's so many different things involved when it comes to any kind of trade or any kind of acquisition. And one of the values of somebody like Dorian Finney-Smith is that next year, the contract that he has for $15.3 million is a player option, and then he's done. He's off their books. You know what I mean? So it gives the Cavs, theoretically, it gives the Cavs a little bit of financial flexibility moving forward that if they were to lock Isaac Okoro into a multi-year deal, whether it's $8 million per year, $10 million per year, $11 million per year, the fact that it's a multi-year deal, it would then run into the extensions of Donovan Mitchell, the extensions of Evan Mobley, and the time when the Cavs get really, really pricey. So that's part of the equation, is that it allows the Cavs theoretically, again, because I'm not sure that they would do the deal, but it allows the Cavs theoretically to get a comparable enough player who can shoot from the outside, who can guard multiple positions, not at the same level of a defender as Isaac, and we totally understand that, but comparable enough where you don't feel like you're losing too much on the court and you're gaining potential financial flexibility, which is going to be important when it comes to team building for this group, especially with how expensive this roster is going to continue to get. So if the Cavs are going to make any kind of sign and trade deal involving Isaac, it's not just, oh, we want a player that's better than him, or, oh, we want a skill set that fits better in Kenny Atkinson's system. It's, okay, what's their contract situation? How long is that contract situation? Does that prevent us from having to pay 4 years of Isaac Okoro? Like, all of those things are in place. when you have any kind of conversation about these types of things. And look, if the Cavs liked a sign and trade offer enough, they would have already made the deal. They've gotten sign and trade offers from various teams across the NBA for Isaac specifically, but none that have been appealing enough for them to say, one, we're going to accept the deal, and two, we're going to be willing to give up on Isaac. At this point, they're still saying none of those packages are good enough. We still see a pathway to bringing him back in some capacity, and some capacity of Isaac, whatever the contract is going to be, is better than anything that has been offered to them at this point. Maybe a team boosts the offer. Maybe Brooklyn does. Maybe Utah gets involved. Maybe Detroit gets involved. Maybe Atlanta, where Isaac is from, maybe they get involved. The Los Angeles Clippers thing does not pass the smell test, but there are reports out there about the Clippers. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. They just paid Derrick Jones Jr. 3 years, $30 million to do the same things that they want Isaac to do, theoretically. They already have somebody very similar to him in Terrence Mann. So that one doesn't really pass the smell test, but maybe one of these teams does step up and they give an offer that is a little bit better. But it's not just, hey, can we find an upgrade on Isaac, or can we find somebody with a better skill set than him? It's part of this is, does whatever deal it would be allow us to not have to pay Isaac deep into the future? And that comes across mean, but that is the kind of contract that could age poorly if it's a little bit too high.
Chris, and I've talked to some Detroit Pistons personnel, reporters, people behind the scenes, and trying to figure out how likely that situation could be, right? Because we talked about that being a high chance possibility because of Detroit having the cap space, because of JB being someone that Isaac liked playing for, things of that nature. But the tough thing about that situation is Detroit only has one roster spot
Yep.
available. And obviously, you look at their roster, they got Jaden Ivey, they got Asar Thompson, guys that can kind of play the same role as Isaac, kind of do the same thing, right? But
They
still
just
need to
brought
be
in
developed.
Beasley. They just brought in Tim Hardaway Jr.
Right. And the other thing with Dorian Finney-Smith is we understand that Isaac Okoro has grown as a shooter over the years, but
Mm-hmm.
Isaac Okoro has grown as a shooter from the corners, basically, right? There is an opportunity this coming season for him to potentially get more volume from different spots on the perimeter. But at least this last season, I saw a shot chart between comparing Dorian Finney-Smith and Isaac Okoro on X, formerly Twitter, today. And I mean, it is a drastic difference because you see there's a lot of green and a lot of red on the corners for Isaac Okoro, and there's just a lot of red spread out on the 3-point line for Isaac Okoro as well. But Dorian Finney-Smith, there's like X's and green spots throughout the entire perimeter. And also, you think about volume, right? We talk about how important volume is to these spectrums. One, Isaac Okoro has been playing in the league for 4 years, and he still has a lower 3-point overall career percentage than Dorian Finney-Smith, who's played in
Mm-hmm.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 seasons in the NBA, if I'm not mistaken. So, I mean, it's a drastic difference, but we also understand how important it is for this offense that Kenny Atkinson's going to bring in, that we are presuming is going to be a run and gun kind of situation where you
Mm-hmm.
can't just be running to the corner and putting your hand up like, I'm here, I'm open. You have to be able to shoot from everywhere on the floor to be able to help this offense create schemes where you can't just understand what's going to happen on each possession, like what happened with the J. Bickerstaff era in the offense that he ran.
And DFS has a little bit more size, a little bit more length to him. He can play the 3 and the 4. Isaac is more of a 2 and a 3. And if you think about the 2 and the 3, based on this roster construction, that's probably the deepest position that the Cavs have. That's probably the most crowded position that the Cavs have when it comes to trying to get minutes. Dorian Finney-Smith may be considered more valuable because he can fill minutes at the 3 and the 4, and that means maybe less time for George Niang, Maybe that means not relying on Dean Wade as much as you would probably have to, because he has dealt with so many injuries. He has dealt with so much inconsistency. So the positional um, situations that the Cavs could find themselves in just based on DFS being a little bit taller, a little bit longer, a little bit more capable to defend those kinds of players. It just, I don't know, it makes for a different kind of lineup construction, and it makes for a more smooth fit, I would say, than Isaac. And it doesn't mean that I think on the surface DFS is a better player, and is significantly better as a player than Isaac. But I think on this team, there is logic behind the Cavs wanting to target a player like that.
100%, Chris. 100%. All right. Two last questions from our subtexters before we get out of here. This one's a little bit of a big one. Comes from Anu from San Francisco. He says the Mobley, Allen, and Donovan Mitchell, Darius Garland pairings, positives and negatives, have been well vetted. Let's see what a new system does for them under Kenny Atkinson. But has not one the main issues in the last two playoffs been the lack of bench production? It seems we're just going to roll out the same bench, which has not delivered the last two playoffs. What can be done, or have you heard about in terms of addressing bench production, especially in the playoffs? I mean, I think the big one is like people just got to step up, right? I feel like we've said that a couple times. It feels really blatant, it feels really like blank slated, but like George Niang did not do what he got his contract for. Even Max Strus, who was in the starting lineup, didn't do what he was paid for. Karis LeVert, Dean Wade was not healthy, right? And I think that's the other thing that it comes down to, right? Being able to be healthy at 100% in the games that matter will be the most effective, right? Karis LeVert had to sit out the last game against the Boston Celtics, as well as Donovan Mitchell and Jared Allen. Dean Wade had just come back, wasn't at 100%, was basically playing on one leg. So I think being healthy and being able to actually do what you were paid for is definitely what's going to be the biggest thing for them this coming season if they can get to the playoffs.
Well, there's also two other things here involved. Number one, I do think that stylistically, Sam Merrill is going to be a player that appeals more to Kenny Atkinson than he did JB Bickerstaff. That's part of it. The other thing is, just because the Cavs go into the season, let's say they do go into the season with this particular roster in place, they don't make another significant addition. They bring back Isaac Okoro on some kind of deal, either a multi-year deal at a small number or the qualifying offer. So they go into the season with a very, very similar roster to the one that they had last year. That doesn't mean that that's the team that they'll take into the playoffs. There's a whole nother transaction season, and it doesn't have to happen this off season for this team, right? Maybe they get into a situation and they play out October, November, December, and they're like, oh man, we need some more production off the bench. Or we can't really rely on George Niang when we get into a 7-game series down the road. Whatever the situation may be, they can make a trade at the deadline. They have the kinds of pieces that could be appealing to teams if they want to make small moves around the margins ahead of the trade deadline, or if they want to make a bigger splash around the trade deadline. Now, there's always risk involved in that. How does a guy fit into the system? How does he fit into the hierarchy of the team? Is there enough time for him to get comfortable, get into a rhythm, get up to speed in the system, and how he's going to be used is going to be different, and all that kind of stuff is always going to be in play. But if they don't make another move throughout the course of this summer before training camp, before the start of the regular season, it doesn't mean that they can't still try and be active ahead of the trade deadline. And like I said, Karis LeVert is going to be on an expiring contract, and that's going to be valuable to another team that's looking to shed salary cap space, that's looking for a little bit more financial flexibility into the future. Ty Jerome doesn't make a whole lot of money. They could aggregate his salary together with something. Maybe then they could consider a Dean Wade type deal. Maybe then they could consider a George Niang type deal because he doesn't have um, as much money or as many years attached to the remainder of his contract. So that's the other thing that I think people have to understand is that there is a lot of time for the Cavs to still compile a better, more equipped roster before next year's playoffs start. Next year's playoffs don't start for quick math 12, 9 more months. And that's a freaking pregnancy. That is a long time for Kobe Altman in this front office to try and assess this roster, try and look over the landscape of the NBA, see who becomes available, and see if there's another move that can be made that kind of way.
And Chris, we talked about the moves that we felt like are most feasible for the Cavs at the trade deadline potentials and stuff, depending on what happens in the beginning of the season. Darius Garland is a potential trade piece, right? If things don't go as well as he has been working for this offseason, right? Again, with the social media clicks and trying to figure out what's going on in everybody's lives, right? Darius Garland looks to have been putting on the muscle that we think he needed back in the last season. He looks to be working with trainers on fighting through contact, getting to the rim, not going away from the basket when he's doing that, going towards the basket. He's been getting work in with other NBA players, including Bronny James. It looks like he's also getting work in with Jordan Clarkson, another Cleveland Cavalier former player. I mean, Darius Garland, it feels like to me, this could go one of two ways for Darius Garland, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they're very drastically different. This could be a revenge tour, most improved kind of season where he comes back and shows the entire world that last year was a fluke and all those kinds of things, which I think is very possible because of the determination that we've seen or that I've been looking at and seeing Darius Garland working out with. Or the opposite. He still is not able to play next to Donovan Mitchell to the same capacity that he was before Mitchell arrived in Cleveland. And the Cavs realize that they need to get rid of the smaller backcourt and start to move some things around to gain size, gain spacing, and all those other things. And like I said, those are two very drastically different scenarios. But coming into the season, those are the two things that I've been thinking about when it comes to Darius Garland and his progression and what he needs to do to not only gain the respect that we feel like he's earned already in the league from other players, but also to maintain the respect that he's earned from guys like Kenny Atkinson who already like his game.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, everything that I sensed in talking to Darius in Las Vegas when I was out there and we had our conversation was this was a guy who's very, very motivated. This is a guy who understands that there were a lot of things tied to the struggles that he had this past season. This is a guy who, in some ways, feels like has been forgotten about. This is a guy who is excited about the way that he's going to be used in Kenny Atkinson's system and the ideas that Kenny has to make this offense more dynamic and more diverse. In saying that, we've heard these kinds of things from Darius before, right? So he's going to have to come out and he's going to have to show why he is one of the better young point guards in the Eastern Conference and across the NBA. He's going to have to come out and play better than he did this past season. He's going to have to come out and show that this is a guy who belongs as a core member of this team, and they can't find somebody better than him out there in the trade marketplace. They can't find a better fitting player next to Donovan Mitchell. Darius said it himself. This is where he wants to be. He does not want to be traded. Well, then he's got to go out and he's got to play well so that the Cavs don't have any kind of reason to consider that.
Right, because we got to the point where we had the whole Darius Garland conversation after you talked with him, broke that news that he doesn't want to go. Those were rumors, right? It's now not really in his hands unless he plays well, right?
Right.
It is in his hands, but it's not in his hands, right? The off season, if something happens, that's not in his hands. If it happens during the season or before the trade deadline, after trade deadline, that you could say that he had something to have done with it if he didn't play as well as he could have, right? But the last question of this podcast is a quick one. Hey, Chris, are the Cavs planning on adding a backup center and power forward? Thank you, from William of Pepper Pike.
Yes, I think the final, well, final is a relative term, but for the sake of this conversation, essentially the final roster spot that the Cavs are looking at that is actually available to them is earmarked for a power forward, center, another backup big that Kenny Atkinson believes is a good, trusted veteran, somebody that he can lean on, somebody that can be a leader in the locker room, a la Tristan Thompson last year. So I don't think the Cavs are going to make another significant addition in free agency, or a significant addition in free agency. The names that are available out there are not all that appealing, and the kind of financial limitations that they have are real. But somebody on the veterans minimum to give them another playable depth piece behind Jarrett Allen, Evan Mobley, somebody that may be able to play the 4 and the 5, would certainly be beneficial to this team. And it's something that they have wanted to acquire as soon as free agency started. That was one of their targets. But it has to be the right player, it has to be the right fit, and it has to be the right price based on the other limitations. Here's the other thing I'll say. We've had a lot of different conversations about Isaac and what the Cavs would be looking for in a potential sign and trade package. I would not rule out the possibility of, if it's not the main component of an Isaac sign and trade, but maybe a component of an Isaac sign and trade is a backup big, because the names available in free agency, they're playable. But if the Cavs have to lean on them for any extended amount of time throughout the course of the season because of an Evan Mobley injury, because of a Jarrett Allen injury, they're going to be in rough shape. It's Tristan Thompson, it's JaVale McGee, it's Boban. That's the caliber of player that is still out there in free agency at that particular position. So maybe there's some other center that is buried on a depth chart somewhere that the Cavs could pry away in a secondary deal, or as part of an Isaac Okoro sign and trade or something like that.
Speaking of revenge tours, speaking of guys that want to make a comeback and prove that they can still do it in the league, I don't know if I would be upset with the Cavs if they brought back TT, because of what he means to this team, this organization, and it kind of feels like he would be the right person to push the right buttons when it comes to Darius Garland throughout the season, if that were to be needed. But
he also showed last year that he can play a little bit. We're not going to go overboard in terms of his impact when it comes to on the court, but I was pleasantly surprised and a little bit impressed at what he was able to give the Cavs at various points last year. It was very, very different than the Robin Lopez experience. It was very, very different than the Ed Davis experience. Two other guys that JB brought in to be that last roster spot, trusted veteran, experienced guy coming off the bench, extension of the coaching staff sort of thing. Tristan was all of that, but he also gave quality enough minutes based on the role that he was thrust into. We'll put it that way. This isn't a guy who's going to play 20 minutes a night. This isn't a guy who's going to play 25 minutes a night. You just need somebody to not, really, really hurt you when he's out there on the court spelling Evan Mobley or Jarrett Allen.
And Tristan is definitely a social media guru, Chris, because he's been definitely showing off all workouts in the gym, on the court, all of those things to try and get somebody to believe that he can do it for another year. Because I think we had this conversation before, Chris, and I think you're the one that said it, but who knows? If he can get another contract, he's going to get another contract. But with all that being said, that'll wrap up today's episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. But remember to become a Cavs insider and interact with Chris and me by subscribing to Subtext. Sign up for a 14-day free trial or visit cleveland.com/Cavs and click on the blue bar at the top of the page. If you don't like it, that's fine. All you have to do is text the word stop. It's easy, but we can tell you that the people who sign up stick around because this is the best way to get insider coverage on the Cavs from me and Chris. This isn't just our podcast, it's your podcast. And the only way to have your voice heard is through Subtext. Y'all be safe. We out.